Your Town Matters is funded by the Government of Canada through the Local Journalism Initiative and supported by Cactus Media, Canada's independent community television association.
I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Your Town Matters. My guests today are Brad Henderson, Mayor of the Town of St. Andrews, and Chris Flemming, Chair of the new Planning Advisory Committee in St. Andrews. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So first off, let's just talk a little bit about what the Planning Advisory Committee is and how it got started.
Well, the Planning Advisory Committee is something that a lot of people really don't understand a whole lot. They think it's some sort of committee of council. And we've got to, I'm afraid, go diving into a bit of civics here to get this sorted out. Most people are aware that in governance structure under Canadian Constitution, there are only two levels of governance, and that's the provinces and the federal government. Municipalities are a creation of the provinces they're located in, and every province has some sort of legislation to control what can happen in a municipality, what sort of powers they have, etc., and so on. In New Brunswick, that's the Local Governance Act. But in New Brunswick, for some reason, and I don't know if this is true in other provinces because I haven't researched it, but it seems that the province of New Brunswick wanted to separate out anything that had to do with control of property into a completely separate act. And that act is called the Community Planning Act. And the Planning Advisory Committee is a creature of the Community Planning Act. The Community Planning Act says a municipality has to do one of two things: either belong to a regional planning commission, which the town did for a while, or they could create their own planning advisory committee. Now, I think Brad can fill you in on why the regional route was followed for a while there.
So that's a new change with this council, the switch from the regional to forming a new local one. Can you tell me a little bit about how that change came to be and why?
I certainly can. So for a number of years, the actual Planning Advisory Committee was a St. Andrews specific committee. But on the last council, very early into their mandate, they switched planning services. So normally it was done by town planners that were actually hired by the town of St. Andrews. You got into building inspection done by people that were hired by the town of St. Andrews. What we actually switched last council was to use the services of the Regional Service Commission. And when we did do that, one of the things that they said that had to happen was we had to go to the regional PAC. I don't think that that was something that the previous council was necessarily looking to accomplish. I think that there was some members of the council that thought that there were some benefits of doing so. When you think about how small of a community you are, sometimes if you're just reading town bylaws and making interpretations on them, to have someone outside the community that doesn't necessarily know their neighbor, it had some strength. So that was one thing that was argued. But for me, I always saw it as, if you're making decisions on a community, you should have a really good feel for what that community is. And sometimes they're judgment calls. And if you look at a committee that has maybe individuals from Blacks Harbour or Macadam, what feels right for Blacks Harbour and Macadam might not necessarily feel right for what's for St. Andrews, and vice versa. What we think might be right for St. Andrews isn't necessarily what's right for Blacks Harbour. So to have people in your community that's lived here for a while or new that bring some experience, to have people that live in the community, I think it just makes it stronger in the decision-making process. So what we found out about a year ago is that we were indeed allowed to use their services and have a local PAC again. So that was a change that was done, and Chris can speak to it in a lot more detail than I can, but it really appears that they hit the ground running.
All right, and I'd love to know a little bit about how you report to council, or exactly what your relationship is with town council, and also who your chair, Chris. But how did the new committee get formed?
Oh, well, you'd have to ask Brad about that because I didn't have any role to play in choosing people for the committee?
So the relationship between the PAC and council is they're completely standalone. Like if you look at some advisory boards in the community, they make recommendations to council, but the Planning Advisory Committee is a standalone committee altogether. Council has no say over their decision-making process, and we don't even get to set what their terms and conditions are. They themselves determine that. They pick their own chair. So as far as the members of the Planning Advisory Committee, we did do actually a call in the community for people that were looking to get involved and interested, and the response was overwhelming. We've got I don't know what the final number was. I think there's about 13 people that applied for it. And what we did is we just went to a democratic way where we just put it to a vote, and everybody ranked kind of who they'd like to see on the committee. So everyone had a say, and the top vote getters are the ones that were actually brought forward in a motion. And I think it was a good job. You've got people that, like Mr. Flemming, that former mayor of St. Andrews. He was involved in the Planning Advisory Committee. Longtime resident, but then you've got people that have just recently moved to town, which is important. You want people with different backgrounds, different experiences, male, female. I think that we did a good job of balancing out, and it really has formed a dynamic committee that we're looking forward to all their great decisions ahead. And of course, as we push forward with housing in our community, we're really hoping to find more opportunity to look at higher density housing. There's going to be a lot of decisions that council's going to have to make, but a lot of decisions that the Planning Advisory Committee is going to have to make when it comes to things like variances.
And obviously 2 housing proposals at council just this month that are on the table to talk about. We'll get to that in a little bit. But Chris, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your role and how you will report to council, or how exactly the dynamic works between the two.
Well, the dynamic is, as Brad has already alluded to, there's pretty much a separation there. As I said, the Planning Advisory Committee is a creature of the Community Planning Act, and as a very learned judge of Court of Queen's Bench said, you model yourself on that Community Planning Act. If the Community Planning Act says you can do something, you can do it. But if it says it doesn't say anything about it, then you can't do it. So we have to follow that fairly strictly. The interesting thing is the name of the organization is Planning Advisory Committee, and advising is probably what we do the least. Council is required under the Community Planning Act, whenever they want to make a change to any of the bylaws that control planning property, they have to ask our advice. And that's where that name comes from. Now, mind you, there's nothing that says they have to take it, but they have to ask for it. But primarily what we get involved with, and this is where it becomes a little difficult for people to follow, because they think, okay, there's rules and regulations in place. Those rules and regulations, like most rules and regulations in our lives, apply to everybody across the board, and that's it. This is what, if you run a red light, you're going to get arrested and charged. Okay? When it comes to property, however, we have to sort of haul back and think a bit, because I'm going to put it to anybody in this room. If you look at the property where you live, go out and find another property that's absolutely identical to yours, and you can't do it because it doesn't exist. Maybe in some sort of gated, planned to the nth degree subdivision, there could be said to be identical properties. But in real life, that very rarely happens. So what we're faced with is, and again, the Community Planning Act says, variance from those rules and regulations is allowed. So we're talking about the zoning bylaw, the subdivision bylaw, the building bylaw, and I'm sure there's a couple of others roaming around in there, but usually it's the zoning bylaw that we're dealing with. So here's what I like to put forward as a hypothetical case that describes what variance is about. We will imagine that there's a property owner who has a house that's in the standard serviced residential kind of zoning. He has a house, but he doesn't have a garage. He wants to have a garage. Well, the zoning bylaw allows you to build an accessory building within certain parameters. So he goes and imagines the kind of garage that he wants to have, and everything falls within the parameters of the zoning bylaw, no fuss, no muss, except there's a beautiful mature tree on that property. And it's a beautiful tree. They love it. They have a little patio underneath. The kids have a swing in it. You know, it's part of the family life. That
Sounds
tree.
nice.
It does, doesn't it? It's just one of those apple pie, leave it to beaver moments. And I'm sure I've just crossed off half of the viewership. Leave it to beaver. Anyway,
Never heard of it.
We won't go. Yeah, this is our problem. But what it comes down to is that if that garage is sited as it should be, there's going to be conflict with that tree, and they're going to have to do something like take part of it down or maybe remove the whole tree, you know, something they don't want to do. But if they shift it ever so slightly, then they can avoid this. The problem comes in shifting it, they cross over what's called the side lot line. Now, side lot lines are a fairly modern innovation. You know, if you look down at the housing stock along Water Street, you see all those buildings jammed right up cheek by jowl. That's because there were no side lot lines back in those days. But now we say, if you have a certain property margin there, within that margin, there's another boundary beyond which you cannot build. So you can't get too close to your neighbor. So this person wanting to shift his garage over to preserve the tree is crossing over that side lot line. What does he do? Well, he approaches the planners, and we use, again, as Brad has said, we kept the planning services of the Southwest Region Commission. And thank goodness we did, because they are wonderful people. Learned that in our first meeting last month, because the planning reports are just a dream. I mean, everything is there. Anyway, they go, and the planning people will say to them, well, you have to ask for a variance, and you have to go before the Planning Advisory Committee and say, here's what I want to do. Here's the situation it puts me in. Will you grant me the right to go over by this particular distance the side lot line? And what Planning Advisory Committee do, the question that we're always asking ourselves in any of these things that come up, is, under these circumstances for this property, is it reasonable to allow a variance rather than following the letter of the regulation that says you can't cross that line? So that's in essence what we do. Each month we have a number of these things. And we have to look at them, and we have to look at them, as I said, property by property, because it matters not just the property itself, but the context in which it exists. Who's around them? How close? What sorts of things are going on in that neighborhood? Are there zone changes from this place to the next door place? You know, there's all manner of things that can come into it, and so we follow what the planners have told us, and the planners are, as I said, when I first saw the first reports that came out, the very first thing they put in there was, here's what the municipal plan has to say. And of course, I've been on a bandwagon about that for years, that the municipal plan has to be a living, integral part of the planning process, not just from terms of what council does, but from terms of what we do as a planning advisory committee. So they start with that, and then they talk about what exists in the zoning regulations. And from there, they develop their own statement as to whether things should be approved or not. And we can either follow their advice or not, as we see fit. But they have a recommendation for us. But then we have the applicant who can appear and make whatever presentation they like to make about their own situation. And we also do what is called a polling, which means that we go to properties that surround this property. Usually it's about 100 meters out, but that can change depending on the density of the neighborhood. Sometimes you get more far-flung places, so they go a little wider in order to make sure that everybody has a say. And these people are advised by letter, saying this is what your neighbor is asking us to do, and what do you think about it? Do you agree or do you disagree? And so they can either write letters in to us, or they can actually come and present on their own, and we get to ask them questions. What we're looking for is the idea of, is this reasonable? If it's not reasonable, why isn't it? If it is reasonable, why is it? And then we'll proceed to make a decision based on all of that information that we have.
And then, so what happens with that decision when you make it? Is it final, or do you report it to council?
It is not. It is not final. It goes through a system back to the planner, and it's the planners that issue the building permits and so on. So it's not a matter that council needs to do anything with, because the system for that is already in place. It's an administrative action. And the decision is not necessarily cut and dried there, because there is an appeal process. There is a provincial planning and assessment appeal board. If someone gets turned down, let's say, and they decide our procedure wasn't followed properly, or there's something else wrong there, they can approach the provincial board and ask to be heard on that, so we can be overruled if worst comes to worst.
Okay, and then what's council's role in what PAC is doing?
I know it sounds really simple, but it's almost just stay out of the lane. That's their role. Like, really, maybe I'm simplifying that, but like, the worst thing you could do is have councillors jumping on PAC calls and giving their opinion. It's a standalone board for a reason. But with that being said, there is some shared information that is critical to go back and forth. And when you look at councillors, we all have different portfolios. So Councillor Lee Heenan is in charge of our planning portfolio. So he's actually a member of the PAC. So to say it's completely standalone wouldn't be entirely right. But when Councillor Heenan's in that seat, he's in that seat as a member of PAC. And I guess just to elaborate a little bit on Chris's points is, if you look at some things that come in the community, sometimes you say, oh, right to council, stop this from happening. A lot of the time that is true. That would be an avenue to go. But just recently there was an apartment building that was proposed for the community, and everybody said, oh, you got a right to council on stopping it. Well, the actual parcel of land was zoned correctly for it, but what they were looking for is variances on the height and the amount of parking space that was required. And not to say that those letters don't get forwarded on, but for those decisions, it's not council that makes those decisions. Those are variances that the PAC makes. So although that information gets passed on, as mayor or as a councillor, I don't get to determine what height is a variance and what height is not. So that's probably the biggest takeaway of all of this for the public is, the town sets bylaws, but when you're looking for a variance, that's the most common thing they deal with. That actually goes to the standalone PAC.
Now, you must be expecting to be, we're in a historic community too, so there are so many different levels to which you will be busy. Has it got to that point yet?
Not yet. I fully expect, here we've got a municipal plan which has two parts, because there's a historical aspect to that, and so does the zoning bylaw. So these things, as a matter of fact, I must say that the idea of historicity has already arisen, because even within the planning report on the few items that we've dealt with so far, there has been a statement about historical. I think there's one coming up on this month's docket, actually, that there was a recommendation from the planners that if this accessory building is going to be built, then it should be clad the way the house that it adjoins is clad already. So that would be placed in when you grant a variance. You can also do it with conditions. So PAC can set and say, okay, you have to do such and such if you're going to go ahead, and we will be watching to make sure that you do this, and you do this, and you do this.
Okay, and I'm thinking of issues. One issue last year that we had a lot in council was short-term rentals. Is that something that would now fall with PAC?
It really all depends. So if they are looking for almost like an exemption, so sometimes they can actually, PAC has the right to grant a different use for a property for up to a year. That would be when it might come into play if say there's someone looking to do a short-term rental in maybe a zone that it typically wouldn't be allowed. That would go to PAC. But when you get into actually the short-term rental, the big conversation, the one that obviously was met with controversy, that was the forming of the bylaw, and that was formed by council. But depending on what type of bylaw council is forming, again, if it relates to planning, there's that extra step that has to happen where it goes to PAC, and then they send their feedback to council on it. So there is some back and forth.
And obviously we're in the middle across the country, but here in St. Andrews in particular, a housing crisis, and there have been 2 new buildings proposed, so I imagine you will be playing a key role in the mapping out of these ideas.
One of the things that I'm very much expecting to come forward in this is the concept of density in housing. Because a lot of people appreciate the fact, for example, we used to have, and I can remember this coming up under the previous PAC that I worked on, you got the 160-foot width lots, and people, in many cases, did not like seeing those split back into 80-foot lots, which is all that's required. So we're going to see these kinds of pressures come forward, and that's where your municipal plan becomes, again, so important, and which is why I'm so thrilled when I see all of our planning reports come through with the very first thing in them. Here's what the municipal plan has to say in regards to this particular matter. And density is going to be one of those things. And I'm going to stick my neck out here, I guess. Yeah, we do have to embrace the idea of greater density, because it makes more sense for services. It makes more sense for variability in the housing stock, for the kinds of things that we need to do to attract the different kinds of people. We cannot be a community simply of wealthy retirees from Middle Canada. It's that simple. We have people who work here and they need to live here as well. And so I think we'll probably be seeing some of those pressures come forward. But again, it's the municipal plan and what that says that's going to lead the way. It's not what I think is proper. And of course, as chairman of the committee, I don't say a whole lot. I say, all in favor? You know, that's my common line. But I think there is a kind of leadership role there in a way that if I see people wandering too far off, I come back, take a look at this, you know, and
you get caught in the weeds sometimes.
You can get into the weeds, and you need to focus on what's important. And what's important is, what does the municipal plan say, and then what does the zoning bylaw have to say. So those two should be in lockstep. And if the planning was done properly, and I know we had our planners involved in that municipal plan, so there should be a fairly close lockstep between what the philosophy of the community is, that's the municipal plan, is how do we think about our community, and what are the actual regulations that come from that to make that philosophy work.
And so will what you do apply to that? We have a vibrant downtown, to the business community as well? Will you be taking on overseeing those things?
Anything that comes up that has to do with what people do with their properties, you know, and if they run into restrictions or things that don't work properly for them as regards zoning bylaws and so on, that's our province. That's what we take care of. So it can show up in many different ways.
So if someone is looking for an exemption to a bylaw or wants to contest something maybe their neighbor did, is it through mostly you, Chris, that will be dealing with? No,
people do not approach the Planning Advisory Committee. No.
Cell phone number?
No. No, they go and consult with the planners. That's their job. That's the administrative backbone of this whole thing. The planners act as, and again, I'm going to throw another term at you here, as the development officer of the town. Every town needs to have somebody that's designated as a development officer, and that's the person to whom you go in order to initiate these discussions. Now, again, since we use the regional planning services, and thank goodness we do as far as I'm concerned, then that is where you go. They're located in St. Stephen, are they not?
Correct,
Yeah, you go there and you put your case before them and say, here's what I want to do, or here's what's going on. You know, tell me about this, what's right, what's wrong. And then if there's something that needs to come back to us for, because we're decision makers, we're not planners, okay? So if there's something that needs to come back to us for a decision, then it will through them. They make up the agenda, they send it to me. Sometimes I get consulted. Do you think you want to have this on the agenda at this point, or do you want to delay this, or you know, something like that? But by and large, they create the agenda, they send it down, that's it.
Okay.
It's like council, they're not involved in the day-to-day. Staff is the day-to-day, which the planning advisory committee, or the service commission acts as, but it's like town council. Your councillor shouldn't be involved in your day-to-day operation. It's no different with them.
Mm-hmm. And so what does this do for council? Does it allow you to focus more on other things? What role will the planning advisory committee play that maybe allows
So it's been going on for a while, even when it was with the regional planning advisory committee. The day-to-day of council isn't impacted really by this at all. But I think the importance of it is just going to be that much more relevant. You touched on it. We're looking for density housing. We had 2 presentations the last regular council meeting, and both of them will require variances. So as we figure out how we solve the housing challenges that we have in St. Andrews and diversify our housing inventory, the planning advisory committee's decisions are going to be very relevant to that. And as you look at multiple developers that are coming forward, and when you get into like frontage requirements and stuff like that, I think council has to take that back to say, every time they go to do these, they have to go get a variance. Should we be looking at their actual bylaws to say that that's the problem? Like, you know, if every time someone needs a fence, they need to go to the planning advisory committee, there reaches a certain point where you got to ask yourself.
And believe it or not, that actually happened in the previous. Everybody started, all of a sudden, we were seeing applications coming out of the woodwork every month for people wanting to have a 6-foot fence. And at the time, the bylaw said the maximum height for fence was 5 feet. So we got scratching our heads and saying, where is this coming from? And where it was coming from is that most people were buying kit fences. And kit fences are standardized at 6 feet.
6 feet.
So we sent a polite note over to council saying, would you, for heaven's sakes, modify that bylaw and put the maximum height up to 6 feet so we can stop having all of these variances coming at us.
And that's the big debate. When variances become the norm, where almost everything you do, you have to get a variance, you've got to look at your zoning bylaws. You've got to look at your different bylaws and say, does this one really make sense? Because if you're the resident or the one that's looking to at least develop the property, you know, it does delay the process. So like, you know, is it relatively painless? I hope so, but the reality is it's not ideal for the people that are looking to enjoy their property. So you've always got to touch base and make sure that the bylaws make sense.
And this underlines the whole concept about a municipal plan and the bylaws that depend from it, is that this, I used the word before, this is living stuff. I mean, this is going on from day to day, and people's ideas will change and modify over periods of time as new conditions become apparent. You know, you look at it as you go along. There's absolutely nothing to prevent you from changing a municipal plan if you think it needs it at any time during its life cycle. And if something comes up that way, then change it.
Thank you both for being here. I hope to have you back again soon to talk about this more.
Thank you.
My guests today have been Brad Henderson, Mayor of the Town of St. Andrews, and Chris Flemming, Chair of the Planning Advisory Committee in St. Andrews. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Your Town Matters.